Okay, I'll be continuing my reading from the book The Battle of Adwa, African Victory in the Age of Empire by Raymond Jonas. Chapter 5, Black in Service of White. The words Dogali and the 500 became shorthand in Italy for the horrible cost that imperial ambitions could bring. At the same time that the monument in Rome sought to place the sacrifice of the 500 on a path leading to a future that would justify it, Italian political leadership hit upon a new scheme. Why place Italy's sons in harm's way when there were Africans ready to take up arms in the service of Italy as professional soldiers? When the Italians turned to the African population for recruits after the Dogali, they followed local precedent. When Egypt sought to invade Ethiopia in the 1870s, it hired foreign officers, including veterans from the American Civil War, as well as Danes, Germans, and Austrians, who had fought in European wars of 1864 and 1866. These veteran officers commanded Egyptian soldiers as well as mercenaries drawn from the Ethiopian periphery. Similarly, when the Italians wished to expand their military might in East Africa, they put on a recruitment call. Word passed from village to village. At the appointed time, dozens of potential recruits gathered. Their origins were diverse: men from the Red Sea coastal villages, men from the Sudan, men from the Ethiopian highlands as far away as Gondar and Shoa. Recruiters did not discriminate by language or creed. Muslim and Christian were welcome. Selection was pitiless. After the recruits mustered, a European officer would stride among the ranks, sending half the men on their way with a word or a gesture, too young, too old, too thin. Then a brutal endurance test would begin. An officer mounted on horseback would lead the aspirants at a slow gallop over hills and across streams. The sole purpose of the cross-country trek was to winnow the field. As the distances mounted, 3, 6, 9, 12 miles, men fell behind and the field thinned. At the end, 4 or 5 might remain. They were the elect, the chosen, the few. A brief medical examination came next, then a bath and the distribution of clothing, a white tunic and half-height white pants. These outfits were a dressed-up version of the everyday wear, typical of East Africa, a belted white smock over white pants that are generous at the hips but tight at the upper calf or ankle. For many recruits, these might be the finest clothes they had ever worn. It was only the beginning of the transformation. The ensemble was completed by a short jacket with embroidered arabesque flourishes and, for the head, a red tarbush or fez. Last came the tools of the soldier's trade: a rifle, a bayonet, and a cartridge pouch of red leather. Forming the Askari battalions, recruits were assigned to distinct units, identified by a sash worn around the waist. The first 4 battalions were distinguished by sashes of red, blue, purple, and black. The 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th native battalions, respectively. As Italy pushed out of Massawa up into the highlands, its military needs grew. By the 1890s, 4 battalions were added, increasing the count of native battalions to 8, each of just under 1,000 men. The new units adopted sashes of Scotch plaid, green, white, and yellow. These soldiers, known as Bashi Buzuk, an Ottoman term, or Askari, looked sharp in their uniforms of white linen or cotton. A smart uniform was part of the appeal of military service, but motives for joining varied. Some recruits were escaping a criminal past. Others, refugees from the slave trade, for example, sought as a way to start life over. For everyone, soldiering meant security, food, clothing, and steady pay. A soldier signed up for a 1-year term in exchange for which he received 1.5 lire per day. While the sum was not huge, a mere fraction of what a European soldier would have received, it represented a fine wage in Africa. For a young man, it was enough to support a wife, whom the smart uniform helped to attract, start a family, and after a year of savings, buy a mule or other work animals. In addition to a stable income in an economy that was otherwise precarious, service offered prestige. The status of the soldier or warrior is very high in Ethiopian society and in East Africa generally. Most askari re-upped after their year of service. Military service offered reliable income, local esteem, and social ascent. A year or two of soldiering could buy a farmer's life. A soldier was someone with a future. What the Italians got in return were soldiers who would fight for Italy, even though they were not Italian. The askari were foot soldiers of uncommon speed and endurance. Except for the coastal lowlands, Eritrea and Ethiopia are at high elevation, above 6,000 feet. It wasn't easy for European troops to adapt to the thin air and extremes of temperature at altitude. Even after acclimation, European soldiers never matched the speed and agility of native troops. Askari units led by Italian officers mounted on mules or horseback could move with astonishing speed compared to European infantry standards. Paul Laribar recounts having received orders to move his native battalion, stationed at Asmara, to reinforce Italian positions at Agordat, some 118 miles away. Laribar's askari, led by mounted officers, completed the journey in 3 days, averaging well over 30 miles a day in marches of 9, 12, and 15 hours. Napoleon's armies, noted for their speed among European armies, might on occasion achieve 25 miles a day. Such mobility put Italian forces on par with Ethiopian forces, taking away the speed advantage the Ethiopians enjoyed when marched against Italian soldiers. During the military campaigns of 1895, when Italy vastly increased the area of land under its rule, speed meant that the Italians could pursue, overtake, and defeat Ethiopian forces even when the latter were in full retreat. Such a feat would have been simply unattainable by European units. Askari battalions were always commanded by European officers, but askari could enter their leadership ranks as non-commissioned officers. These subaltern or non-commissioned officers were chosen from among the more seasoned and dedicated askari. They were distinguished by a red fez topped with a tassel or pompon, whose color varied according to battalion. Thanks to the askari, Italian commanding officers enjoyed a level of attention typically enjoyed only by Ethiopian chiefs. Just as the tent of an Ethiopian leader would form the center of any camp, so the tent of a European officer would constitute the core of an askari battalion camp. As soon as the day's march was concluded, the first duty of the askari was to prepare the tent of their commanding officers. They also served as bodyguards, never letting the officers out of their sight. If local inhabitants approached with an offer of food or drink, the askari would see that the local first sampled his own food or drink to ensure that it was fit to be consumed. And while it may seem strange that the askari would take up arms against other Africans and even fellow Ethiopians, for many loyalty was personal and local rather than national or Ethiopian. Banditry was common in East Africa, and relations between neighboring regions and settlements could as often be predatory as cooperative. In such circumstances, the bonds of status, income, military service, and even friendship could trump all others. When Askari battalions returned from a mission, they remained a team. Askari lived with their families in tukuls rather than in barracks, but the huts were grouped around the residence of their commanding officer, and the entire battalion-level settlement was enclosed by a palisade. In an obvious sense, the existence of the Askari was organized around their identity as soldiers. Strong bonds formed. Italian military policy was, in its own way, family-friendly. This tended to encourage a broad identification with the European occupiers. The spouses of the Askari were permitted to go on campaign with their husbands, and frequently did so. Children were the inevitable result of such policies, and it was not unusual for entire families, in effect, to join the service, even to fight beside husbands and fathers and support them in combat. In the fighting at Megale, Askari family members served as runners, dodging Ethiopian fire to bring up ammunition. One Askari spouse died in such a role, cut down bringing rifle rounds to her husband. Italian officers were surprised but pleased to hear Askari sing praise patriotic Italian songs as they marched or built fortifications. The archival record and memoir literature are full of statements of praise and affection from Italian officers. "Our faithful Askari" is a recurring phrase in the historical record. With few exceptions, it does not appear to be an exaggeration. Askari was encouraged to learn Italian for both military and cultural reasons, with limited success. A survey of some 3,600 Askari revealed that more than half could neither speak nor understand the language. Hierarchies of command reflected hierarchies of race. When General Antonio Baldissera proposed that European and African troops serve side by side in mixed units, the idea was shot down by Rome. Baldissera's innovative proposal suggests that racial ideas were still in flux. Its rapid demise shows that such categories were rapidly hardening. The Italians were indifferent to religion when they recruited Askari. Religious difference seemed not to have interfered in the formation of strong soldierly bonds between Askari of Christian and Muslim background. Soldiers followed their own religious traditions when it came to the butchering of meat, for example, or the consumption of wine, from which Muslim Askari refrained. Both the Muslim and Christian Askari declined to consume preserved Italian meats, which would not have been prepared according to Islamic or Ethiopian Orthodox rules. Love in Africa. If Askari men found it normal to combine military service and domestic partnership, the situation was somewhat different for European men on duty in Africa. By the end of 1895, there were more than 10,000 Italian soldiers on campaign. Many more served in support roles, with still more arriving each week. Only the wives of high-ranking officers were permitted to follow their spouses. Fewer still agreed to do so. Rosalia Pianavia followed her husband to Eritrea, where she lived during his 3-year tour of duty, but her situation was exceptional. Her husband was a colonel, even second in command of Italian forces. What this meant for the sex lives of Europeans and Africans is interesting to imagine, but difficult to document. Memoirs and diaries are largely silent on the issue. One is left only with tantalizing but inconclusive passing references. What, if anything, should we read into the fact that a certain Sergeant Finiello was known around the barracks as La Signorina, or the Miss? When the Italians returned in 1936, they would issue strict regulations aimed at safeguarding Italian quote-unquote racial purity. In the 1880s, they articulated no such concern, a measure of how far race had yet to travel as a concept and a boundary. Prostitution certainly existed at Massawa, as in any port city, and at Asmara too, but many Italian soldiers established long-term relationship with Eritrean women whom they supported in roles situated somewhat between the courtesan and the spouse. These women were known as madamas, a title typically reserved for spouses. General Giuseppe Arimondi, who would die at Adwa, had a madama of legendary beauty. Although the relationship between soldier and madama had a status approaching that of marriage, the bonds of marriage could be loosely interpreted. Like any marriage, these relationships produced their share of drama. Cesare Nerazzini spent years in Eritrea as a high-level diplomatic representative. He had his madama when he was in residence at Assab on the Red Sea coast, but both Nerazzini and his madama had other lovers. When Nerazzini discovered Mocha, a dancer at a nearby village, he had a shack built for her in Assab, not far from where Nerazzini lived with his madama. Meanwhile, Nerazzini's madama took lovers of her own. Among them was Rosenretter, a Swiss machine installer posted briefly to Assab to set up a water distiller on behalf of a German manufacturer. When Rosenretter returned to Europe, he was replaced by a handsome Florentine named Nozzoli. His purpose in Assab is unknown, but the affable Nozzoli made the most of his time there, befriending Nerazzini's madama. His sojourn in Assab ended abruptly, however. He was last seen living by way of the window when Nerazzini came home early one day. In many cases, the madama relationship were regularized, even institutionalized. Chris Prouty, in her fine work on this period, argued that many native families, especially impoverished ones, saw that to place a daughter in a relationship with a European could represent a significant opportunity. The European was expected to supply a home, a tukul, adequately furnished along with grain and cash. The soldier's consort might also receive a mule richly adorned with colorful tack. Above all, she received the title of madama, a status that conferred prestige. It also gave her a place in the hybrid European-African society with a social rank commensurate with that of her patron. Thus, the madama of the captain could lord it over the madama of a lieutenant. Within local society, the madama was seen as married, a common law spouse, with all the honor and respect pertaining thereto. The elevated status of the madama remained with her even after her Italian partner returned to Europe. The goods she acquired meant that she was notably better off than she might otherwise have been. Culturally, she enjoyed significantly higher status. Newly single, she was free to start over with another European or to marry up within local society. Far more ambiguous was the status of the offspring of these relationships. In similar contexts, such children have been rejected as unpleasant reminders of collaboration with an occupier. One thinks of the children born of French women who had relationships with German soldiers during the Nazi occupation. But this was not always so. Anglo-Indians acquired a particular status during the British Raj, although that status certainly became more ambiguous after 1947. In Eritrea, At least in some cases, the blended children resulting from these relationships were welcomed, sometimes even embraced by the surrounding community. The Ethiopians had some experience in these areas, including European African relationships that were far more casual. When Augustus Wilde arrived in Ethiopia to write a series of articles for the Manchester Guardian about the burgeoning Italo-Ethiopian conflict, he spied a nearly white woman and her daughter who were nearly as fair, living among the local population. He surmised and was later able to confirm that the woman was the product of a liaison that had occurred during the 1868 English expedition against Tedros. The woman would have passed as an Englishwoman and in fact was known locally as the Englishwoman, the Inglese. She was born after the brief English campaign and raised within the Ethiopian community. She eventually married and by the time she was spotted by Wilde had a daughter of her own. Similarly, at least some of the children of Italian Eritrean couples readily found a place in African society. When Major Pietro Toselli died in combat late in 1895, he left behind his Madama and a newborn boy. She remarried. Her new husband adopted Toselli's son as his own. The couple named the boy Petros in honor of his natural father. Other sources present a more complicated picture. Some photographs from the period depict European African couples posing for studio portraits very much like those one would expect of European couples. Picture of domestic bliss, which tends to validate the image of the Madama as the social and sentimental equivalent of the spouse. Other photos depict Eritrean women posing naked or nearly so alongside their European spouses. They are surrounded by props, animal skins, cheap jewelry, biased toward exotic sexual allure rather than cultivated domesticity. Locale mattered too. The somewhat elevated status of the Madama was a better fit for the relatively circumscribed community of the highlands, especially Asmara. In the more transient world of Massawa, as in port cities everywhere, casual relations predominated. Theater productions, of which the Italians seemed inordinately fond, sometimes featured half-naked, costumed local women who functioned more as props than as performers. Rosalia Pianavia, an officer's wife and therefore a European Madama, was troubled by the number of mixed-race infants in Eritrea and their insecure status. The role of the Italian fathers in the lives of these children ended either with their death in combat, as in the case of Toselli, or with the completion of their tour of duty. Pianavia admitted disgust at the thought of black and white living together, but the offense was not so much that of racial mixing as that these couples were heedless of the consequences of a union fated to end. Sooner or later, their children would be fatherless. Rosalia Pianavia made the care of these children a personal crusade, relying on a blend of compassion and guilt to drum up funds for ongoing care. Her first case was Abadi, who had lost her mother. Her father, an Italian officer, entrusted Abadi to Pianavia when he returned to Italy. Pianavia accepted responsibility for the child, renaming her Marianina. Pianavia decided to create a home for orphan children. It took work to persuade colonial authorities to grant permission for her initiative. The risks to the partisans of empire were considerable. Creating an orphanage meant acknowledging colonial practices, sexual practices that flouted moral conventions, and it highlighted the imbalances of power inherent in the colonial enterprise. In time, Pianavia's venture was approved. Mariania became the first of many children consigned to Pianavia's care. The little girl was followed by Angelina, Vittorina the First, Vittorina the Second, Lucino, Oreste, and Giovannino, the latter two brothers. Rosalia's genius was to spotlight the responsibility of fathers and turn that responsibility into support for their children. In effect, it was a guilt tax. With the approval of Padre Bonomi, the military chaplain, Pianavia held collections in Eritrea to raise funds. She used the proceeds to fund an orphanage, the Institute of the Little Innocents, where abandoned and orphaned children could find food, shelter, and care. The humanitarian core of her project, which the term Little Innocents brilliantly captured, garnered support in Italy, where fundraisers yielded additional funds. The city of Genoa hosted a festival with proceeds dedicated to Pianavia's Institute. Genoa's benefit raised 28,000 lire, which financed the construction of buildings at the institute and staffed them with caregivers, both African and European. Pianavia secured the charitable engagement of a female religious order. The nuns served both as guardians and teachers. Pianavia's Institute of the Little Innocents could only be a palliative and never addressed the contradictions inherent in empire. In fact, the stories of the Ascari and the Madamas are in some ways analogous, showing the powerful forces at work to encourage African collaboration with European occupiers. As long as European presence seemed permanent, realism, as well as access to money and prestige, argued in favor of accommodation. Thanks for watching. That is it.